A teenager put my son in the hospital and smirked the entire time. The judge wiped that look off his face. My son Eli is 13 years old. He's small for his age. He's always been small. He was born premature and spent his first 2 weeks in the NICU. And ever since then, he's been the shortest kid in every class photo. He gets it from my side. I was the same way growing up, but Eli never let it bother him. He played soccer even though he was half the size of the other kids. He went to school every day without complaining. He had a good group of friends, and he was the kind of kid who came home and told you about his day without you having to ask. He was just a good kid. Quiet. Kind. Never bothered anybody. There was a kid in the neighborhood named Drew. Drew was 17, built like he was already in college, and had the kind of attitude that made you uncomfortable the second he opened his mouth. He rode around on a dirt bike that was way too loud for a residential street, and he'd blast through the neighborhood without caring who was outside. His parents had money. They lived in the biggest house on the block, and his dad drove a new truck every year. Drew had been in trouble before. He got kicked out of one school for fighting. He broke a kid's skateboard at the park because the kid wouldn't let him use it. He threw a rock at a neighbor's dog once, and when the neighbor confronted his parents, they said boys will be boys and closed the door. Drew did whatever he wanted because nothing ever happened to him. One afternoon, Eli was riding his bike home from his friend's house. He was on the sidewalk where he was supposed to be. Drew came flying down the street on his dirt bike, cut across the sidewalk, and hit Eli. Didn't clip him, hit him. Eli went off his bike and landed on the concrete. His helmet cracked. His arm broke in 2 places. He hit his head so hard on the curb that he had bleeding inside his skull. My wife Amira got the call from a neighbor who saw it happen, and we met the ambulance at the hospital. Eli was unconscious. They rushed him in and told us he had a fractured skull, a brain bleed, and a compound fracture in his left arm. He was in surgery for 4 hours. When the doctor came out, he told us Eli was stable, but the next 48 hours were critical. Amira didn't leave that chair for 2 days. I didn't eat for a day and a half. Our 12-year-old daughter Paula stayed with my sister and called every 2 hours asking if her brother was okay. Eli woke up on the 3rd day. He didn't remember what happened. He asked me why his arm was wrapped up. I told him he had an accident. He said his head hurt. He was in the hospital for 9 days. When we finally brought him home, he couldn't walk straight for a week. He had headaches every day for a month. He missed 6 weeks of school. His soccer season was done. He still flinches when he hears a loud engine. He's 13. While Eli was in the hospital, Drew's parents sent us a card. Not a visit, not a call. A card. It said they hoped our son felt better soon, and they included a $50 gift card to a restaurant. My son had a brain bleed, and they sent us the equivalent of a coupon. Drew was charged. Because of the severity of what happened, the prosecutor pushed to have him tried as an adult. The hearing to decide that was where things got interesting. Drew showed up to court in a button-down shirt that still had the fold creases in it like his mom bought it that morning. His dad Flynn was behind him in a suit. His mom Juliet was next to Flynn holding a tissue even though she wasn't crying. They had a private attorney who probably cost more per hour than I make in a day. Drew sat at the table and I watched him. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't scared. He was leaning back in his chair whispering to his lawyer and almost smiling. At one point he looked back at his dad and gave him this little nod like everything was going to be fine, like this was a speed bump. His attorney argued that Drew was a minor with no prior convictions and that this was a tragic accident and that trying him as an adult would ruin his future. He talked about Drew's grades and his college plans and how he had his whole life ahead of him. He said the family was willing to cover medical expenses. Drew nodded along the entire time like his lawyer was reading his biography. Then the prosecutor laid out what happened. He talked about Eli's injuries, the fractured skull, the brain bleed, the compound fracture, the 9 days in the hospital, the 6 weeks of missed school, a 13-year-old boy who still gets headaches and flinches at loud sounds. He talked about Drew's history in the neighborhood, the fights, the expulsion, the rock at the dog. He said this wasn't a mistake. He said this was a pattern of reckless behavior that finally caught up with a kid who'd never been held accountable for anything in his life. Drew stopped leaning back in his chair during that part. Then the judge spoke. Her name was Hortense. She looked at Drew for a long time before she said anything. She started talking in this calm, steady voice that made the room feel smaller. She looked at Drew's attorney and said she'd reviewed the school records, the police reports from prior incidents, and the full medical file. She said she wanted to make sure she understood the argument. She said, "You're telling me this was an isolated accident?" Drew's attorney stood up straighter and said, "Yes, Your Honor. A tragic one-time event." Hortense picked up a piece of paper and started reading out loud. The fight that got Drew expelled, the skateboard he broke, the rock at the neighbor's dog. She put the paper down and said, "Which part of this is isolated?" The attorney tried to say those were minor incidents and none resulted in charges. Hortense cut him off and said, "No charges doesn't mean no pattern. It means no one held him accountable. That's not the same thing." The courtroom went completely silent. Drew wasn't leaning back anymore. He was sitting up straight with his shoulders tight and his half-smile gone. Hortense looked right at Drew and said she had a question for him directly. She asked him if he understood what a compound fracture was. Drew said, "Yes, ma'am." She asked if he understood what a brain bleed was in a 13-year-old. Drew said, "Yes." Then she tilted her head and said, "Then why are you smiling in my courtroom?" The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. That smug, relaxed look fell off Drew's face like someone wiped it away. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. Flynn shifted forward in his seat. Juliet squeezed the tissue she'd been holding all day. Drew's attorney jumped in and said his client was nervous, and what the judge was seeing was anxiety, not a smile. Hortense didn't even look at the attorney. She kept her eyes on Drew and he couldn't look back. He dropped his eyes to the table. For a second, the energy in the room got lighter, like maybe the hard part was over. Then Hortense said, "I'm not finished." Those 3 words put the whole room right back. She asked to see the photographs of Eli's injuries. Drew's attorney objected and said the photos were not necessary for a transfer hearing. Hortense said, "Overruled." The prosecutor pulled up the photos on the screen near the front of the courtroom, and there was Eli, my boy, lying in that hospital bed with tubes coming out of his arm and his eyes closed and his face swollen and bruised in colors I didn't even know skin could turn. The next photo was his arm, the compound fracture, the skin broken open, the bandages soaked through with dark stains. The next one was the back of his head, the staples. Rows of metal staples holding my son's skull together like he was something that had been taken apart and put back together with hardware. I heard Amira next to me take this sharp breath, this quick little little inhale like she'd been punched in the stomach. I reached over and took her hand. She squeezed it so hard I could feel her fingernails pressing into my skin. I didn't pull away. I didn't want to. I just held on and looked at those photos of my kid and reminded myself to breathe. Hortense left those pictures up on the screen. She didn't ask anyone to take them down. She didn't move on. She just let everyone in that room sit with what they were looking at. Drew glanced at the screen for maybe 2 seconds and then looked down at the table. His attorney stared straight ahead. Flynn kept his jaw tight. Juliet turned her head away completely. But Hortense wasn't letting anyone off the hook. She sat there with those images on full display, and the room had to deal with it. That was my son up there. That was what Drew did. And for the first time, it felt like someone with real power was making sure nobody in that room could pretend it didn't happen. Hortense had the prosecutor read the doctor's full statement aloud. The surgery, the 4 hours it took, the risk of permanent brain damage, the daily headaches, the problems with balance, the flinching at loud sounds, the nightmares. When he finished, he said, "Eli is 13. He was riding his bike on a sidewalk." Then Hortense looked at me and said she wanted to hear from me directly. I stood up and my legs felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. I could feel every single person in that room looking at me, and for a second my throat just closed up. My voice shook when I started talking, and I didn't try to hide it. I said Eli was the kind of kid who tells you about his day without you asking. You pick him up from school, and before you even pull out of the parking lot, he's already going through everything that happened. Who said what at lunch, what they did in science class. I said he played soccer even though he was half the size of everyone else on the field, and he never complained about it. He just showed up and tried his hardest every single game. I had to stop for a second because my voice cracked. I swallowed and kept going. I said when he woke up in the hospital, he asked me why his arm was wrapped up because he didn't even remember getting hit. He didn't remember any of it. I said he still flinches when he hears a loud engine and he won't ride his bike anymore. He used to ride his bike every single day and now he won't touch it. He's afraid to ride his bike. I sat back down. That was all I had. I didn't plan some big speech. I just told the truth about my kid. Amira was crying quietly next to me. Not loud, not dramatic, just tears and her hand holding mine and her shoulders shaking. Hortense looked at me after I sat down and I saw something in her expression. Not pity. More like she understood. Drew's attorney asked for a recess. Hortense said, "No, we're going to finish this today." Then Flynn stood up in the gallery, right there in the middle of the hearing. He just got to his feet like he was at a town hall meeting and not a courtroom. He said, "Your Honor, my son is a good kid. He made a mistake. A bad one. We know that. But we're willing to pay for everything. Every medical bill, every follow-up, whatever the family needs. We just want to make this right." He said it like he was negotiating a deal. Like this was a business problem and he had the checkbook to fix it. Hortense looked at him. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look angry. She just looked at him the way you look at someone who walked into the wrong room. Hortense looked at him and said, "Sir, sit down. You are not addressing this court." Flynn didn't sit right away. He stood there for a second like he wasn't used to being told what to do. His attorney tugged on his sleeve. Flynn sat down. Juliet put her hand on his arm. Not like she was comforting him. More like she was holding him in place so he wouldn't do it again. Hortense waited until Flynn was fully seated and then she said, "Medical bills do not undo a fractured skull." She said it the same way she'd said everything else. Calm, clear, but it landed like a hammer. I sat there thinking about that $50 gift card they sent to the hospital and how Flynn thought he could just write a check and make all of this disappear. Then the prosecutor stood up one more time. He said based on witness statements and the accident reconstruction report, Drew was traveling at over 40 miles per hour at the time of impact, on a residential sidewalk, on an unregistered dirt bike. He paused and then he said after the impact, Drew did not stop. He did not check on the victim. He did not call 911. He did not call his parents. He rode his dirt bike home. It was a neighbor who called emergency services. Drew went home. That was the part that hit me hardest because I didn't know all of that until right then. My son was lying on a sidewalk with a broken skull and a broken arm, and the kid who hit him just rode away. He left my 13-year-old son bleeding on the concrete and went home. Hortense wrote something down. Drew's attorney looked at the note and then slowly, quietly closed his folder. Just closed it and set his pen on top and sat there. He knew it was over. But before Hortense could rule, Drew's attorney stood up one more time. He argued Drew was 17 with no prior convictions, and trying him as an adult would follow him forever. He cited 2 cases where judges in similar situations kept the minor in juvenile court. He said the law exists to protect minors, even minors who make terrible mistakes. And the argument landed. I could feel it in the room. A couple people shifted in their seats. Because Drew's attorney wasn't saying Drew was innocent. He was arguing Drew was young, and that is a much harder thing to fight. He pulled out a letter from Drew's school counselor describing him as a student who showed real improvement. He read a line about Drew having the capacity for growth and rehabilitation. He handed it to Hortense. She read it with a completely blank face. The prosecutor pushed back and said the severity of the injuries should be the deciding factor, but even as he talked it felt thin, like he was stacking the same bricks again. Drew's attorney fired back with case law. He knew case numbers and details. I felt Amira's hand trembling in mine, and I started to feel something cold in my chest. The thought that maybe this judge was going to rule Drew stays in juvenile court, that all of this was just the judge being thorough before she let the system do what it always does for kids with money and good lawyers. I could already see Flynn putting his hand on Juliet's shoulder. I could already see Drew's little nod coming back, and then Drew did something that changed everything. While his attorney was making that final argument about rehabilitation and the law protecting minors, Drew leaned over toward his attorney's chair. He whispered something, but he didn't whisper quietly enough. There was a microphone on the table, one of those small flat ones near the front edge. It picked up what Drew said. Not perfectly, but enough. Drew said, "Can we just get this over with? This is so stupid." I heard it. Amira heard it. The prosecutor heard it. The people in the first 2 rows heard it. And Hortense heard it. Her pen stopped moving. Her eyes came up from the paper and locked right onto Drew. Drew's attorney was still standing. He was mid-sentence, something about the juvenile system and developmental science, and he trailed off because he saw the judge's face change. He looked down at Drew. Drew was still leaning back from the whisper, still had that look on his face like he'd just said something normal, like he'd asked what time it was. He didn't know. He didn't realize the microphone had picked it up. He didn't understand that every person in that courtroom had just heard him call the whole thing stupid. The hearing about the 13-year-old boy whose skull he fractured. The proceeding where a judge was deciding whether his actions were serious enough to be treated like an adult's. He called it stupid. Drew slowly started to realize something was wrong. His attorney's mouth was a thin line. Flynn behind him had gone completely still. Juliet's hand was frozen on Flynn's arm. The whole room was holding its breath, and I sat there with Amira's trembling hand in mine, and I watched Drew's face as he figured out what had just happened. As he realized the microphone had caught him, that the judge had heard every word, that he had just told a courtroom full of people that the hearing about the boy he nearly killed was stupid. And for the first time, real fear crossed Drew's face. Not coached nervousness, not the blank stare he'd been hiding behind. Real fear. The kind that comes when you finally understand that nobody is coming to save you. The second those words came through that microphone, I watched Drew's attorney close his eyes, just for a second, just long enough to tell me he knew it was over. Flynn leaned forward in his seat. Juliet pressed the tissue to her mouth. Drew didn't even realize what he'd done, but Hortense had heard him call her courtroom stupid while his lawyer argued that he deserved mercy. She picked up her pen. She looked at Drew one more time. Hortense spoke slowly. She said, "Counselor, you've argued that your client is capable of growth. You've presented a letter from his school. You've cited case law. I've listened carefully." She paused. Then she said, "But I've also listened to your client." She looked at Drew and said, "You were asked to sit in this courtroom and hear about what you did to a 13-year-old boy, and your response was that this is stupid." Drew's attorney didn't object. He just stood there with his hands at his sides. Hortense said she'd reviewed the evidence, heard testimony from the family, seen photographs of a child with staples in his skull. She said Drew was traveling over 40 miles per hour on a sidewalk. He did not stop. He did not call for help. He went home. She said that last part slower. He went home. She said the defense argued that juveniles deserve the chance to change, and she agreed with that in principle. My chest got tight. Then she said, "But that argument requires evidence that the juvenile in question understands the gravity of what they've done." She turned fully toward Drew. Not halfway. She turned her whole body in her chair so she was facing him straight on. She said, "Drew, stand up." Drew's eyes went to his attorney. His attorney gave him a small nod. Drew pushed his chair back and stood up. His hands were shaking. I could see it from where I was sitting. His fingers were trembling at his sides, and he didn't know what to do with them. The lean was gone. The smirk was gone. The kid who walked into that courtroom looking like he was waiting for a dentist appointment was gone. The person standing there now looked small. Smaller than I expected a 17-year-old who was built like a college kid to look. Hortense said, "You hit a 13-year-old boy hard enough to fracture his skull. You broke his arm in 2 places. You caused bleeding inside his brain. He was in surgery for 4 hours. He was in the hospital for 9 days. He missed 6 weeks of school. He is still in pain. He is still afraid." Every sentence was like a step. She was walking him through it one piece at a time so he couldn't hide from any of it. Then she said, "And you think this is stupid?" Drew said, "I didn't mean..." Hortense raised her hand about 6 inches off the desk with her palm facing him. Not fast, not angry. She just lifted it. She said, "I'm speaking." 2 words. That was all it took. Drew's mouth closed. His attorney didn't jump in. Nobody jumped in. The courtroom was dead silent. Not quiet. Silent. Like the air had been sucked out of the room. Hortense said, "I have considered the defense's arguments carefully. I have also considered the pattern of behavior documented by the prosecution." She listed them like items on a receipt, like she was tallying up a bill that had been building for years. She said, "Each time this young man faced no meaningful consequences. Each time someone told him it was okay. Someone paid for it to go away." And then she looked at Flynn. She didn't say his name. She didn't point. She just moved her eyes from Drew to Flynn sitting there in his suit in the gallery. Flynn didn't move. He didn't blink. He sat there like a man who'd been turned to stone. Juliet's hand was still on his arm, but neither of them moved even a little bit. Hortense looked at Flynn for what felt like 10 seconds, but was probably 3, and then she said, "That ends today." I felt Amira's grip on my hand get tighter. I felt my own heartbeat in my ears. She straightened her papers one more time. She picked up her pen and set it back down. She looked out at the courtroom and then back at Drew, who was still standing there with his hands shaking at his sides, and said, "It is the ruling of this court that the motion to transfer the defendant to adult court is granted." Drew's face went white, not pale. White, like someone had pulled a plug and all the color just drained right out of him. His attorney reached over and put a hand on Drew's shoulder. Not in a comforting way. More like he was holding him up, like he thought Drew might fall over. Hortense kept talking. She said the severity of the injuries, the recklessness of the conduct, the failure to render aid, and the defendant's demonstrated lack of remorse made this the appropriate decision. She said every word like she'd written it down ahead of time, like she wanted it on the record exactly the way she meant it. She said, "This court does not exist to protect people from the consequences of their choices. It exists to ensure that those who are harmed receive justice." Flynn stood up halfway out of his seat. His hands went to the back of the bench in front of him and he started to rise like he was going to say something, like he was going to make one more try at fixing this with his voice and his money and his presence, but then he stopped. He just stopped halfway up, caught between standing and sitting, and something in his face broke. Not anger, not disbelief, something deeper than that, like he was looking at his son and seeing for the first time that this was real, that no check and no attorney and no letter from a school counselor was going to put this back together. He sat back down. Juliet dropped the tissue and didn't seem to notice. Drew turned around and looked at his parents. He didn't nod at his dad. He didn't smirk. He looked at them like a kid who just found out the world doesn't work the way he thought it did, like someone who'd been told his whole life that he was untouchable, and just found out in front of a room full of strangers that it was a lie, like someone who realized the speed bump was a wall. Hortense closed her folder and said, "We're adjourned." Eli was at home on the couch when I walked in that night. I sat down next to him and he didn't ask what happened at court. He just looked at me and I looked at him and I told him it mattered. He nodded once and went back to watching TV.